Welcome to the Talent Ledger, a limited video and podcast series which serves as a companion to the article series of the same name. I am your host, Elise Wilding, principal at M Partners, enabling entrepreneurs and fund founders to move from complexity to action at critical inflection points. Across this series, we will explore one simple idea. People and work have become the biggest investment line in the business, and too often the least rigorously governed. This series is built around a 4-part article run. If you would like to read the articles, you can access them through the Talent Ledger landing page. There is a link in the first comment. Today, we'll start with what's really happening beneath the noise about hybrid work: a trust recession, a skills mismatch, and AI repricing work. On subsequent episodes, we move into what leaders do about this, how internal comms shifts from broadcast to behavior change, how HR moves from activity to outcomes, and why none of this sticks without executive governance. Each episode is meant to stand alone, or you can binge them in just a couple of hours. On this episode, we're starting with the platform, 3 forces converging at once: the trust deficit, the skills mismatch, and AI-driven repricing of work. We'll also challenge the distraction that dominates boardrooms, policies that feels like action, but don't actually address the real economies of work. I'm joined by Malcolm O'Neill, Chief Human Resource Officer at the architectural firm The Moore Group, Peter Lyall, co-founder at Ascent Advisory Services, who works with leadership teams on strategy, value creation, and results, and Ed Davis of Agency X, an international brand marketing agency. So let's start with the big idea. When we hear that people are our greatest asset, what truth does that force an organization or a leadership team to admit? Malcolm, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. I think it's such a quick phrase. I think it's very, every company desires to have it, but when I hear that, particularly when I think about, being part of being part of the HR team and being part of the broader leadership team, it always makes me say, so what? We've got this great value, but what are we doing with it? And I think it's an interesting piece because as you perhaps sometimes too, this whole, pursuit of, our greatest asset, or how do we make the people function better, so that what, and so I think it's missing the second half. The other side of the coin is that would our customers view it the same way? And is that really perhaps the actually good to great moment when you start to say, how can our people become our customers' greatest assets? And that perhaps this pursuit of this internal utility is really meant to unlock more customer, a customer back type orientation. So that's when I always hear it. I feel like it's only partial credit. It is an enterprise, and this isn't a nonprofit, and we're really trying to drive more towards a commercial outcome. And what are we doing with that asset?
Yeah, and I think they're only our greatest asset until they're not.
Right.
Which is something that happens all too frequently. And we've seen it on both sides of the Atlantic, and we've all lived and worked through various cycles of economic development and then recession. And people may be the greatest asset, as it says in the company report, but a couple of weeks later, there may be a reason to ask them to leave, which, of course, begs the question, what is loyalty in this environment today? And loyalty is fine when everything is going well, but it becomes a bit stretched when things are tougher. I think I remember speaking to Ed about this before, but you could always tell when people came into your office to resign because they would start with an apology. It would always be a meeting that actually wasn't scheduled either, which I always thought was quite entertaining. It must be serious if it's not in the calendar. And so we get into that situation where, oh, so sorry, Peter, but I've decided to hand in my notice. Well, no, you don't have to apologize. It's your career, it's your life, and you can do exactly what you want to, and you can move on. But be assured that ultimately it's a contract. You're paid to do a job of work, and we'll expect the best from you at that time, and perhaps a bit of goodwill would be good as well. But we'll treat you with respect, and we'll maybe train you and educate you. But are you our greatest asset? Well, questionable would be my take on that.
Yeah, I think just underscoring both those points, if they were and this sort of sets up the rest of the conversation, I suppose. If they are our greatest assets, then there's going to be things that underscore them, right? You're going to be able to quantify that. You're going to be able to qualify that. You're going to have decision rights around it. You're going to have to be able to show a return on what that looks like. And if you really can't show where that spend is going and the outcomes that it buys, it's not really an asset. It's a slogan, right? It's something people say to make, the employees feel good about what it is that they're getting into. It's something to make the managers and the executive leadership team, something, we're friendly, we're people focused, things along those lines. So you really have to watch for that.
And just picking up on the slogan, I mean, don't you think, Ed, that actually it's been a cliche for a long time, and yet it's always a surprise when people are still using it.
Wow.
You'd have thought by now that we'd all come to the conclusion that nobody believes this because people are savvy, and yet it still finds its way into the front page of annual reports and CEO presentations,
And employee manuals, and yeah, that's right. That's right.
The other part that stands out here is if they're an asset, then, Ed, like you said, they can be managed. But managing them means you need a clear system of what management means. Yes, that is starting with, what is the work that has to be done, and therefore what are the roles that need to be, filled to deliver that process. Okay, now what people go into those roles. But then it's also about the broader talent pyramid of your frontline workers, your middle management, your senior leaders. And many organizations, it makes sense to promote internally because you maintain that knowledge base. So you need the learning programs, both for the day-to-day job, but also the, executive training and management training all along the way. And I think, it's easy to say, oh, well, that's HR's job to do all that. But when you think about it as a broader talent system, yes, HR probably needs to make sure that all your trainings are codified and everybody has the right seat on the org chart. But it's ultimately up to every single manager in the organization to make sure that they're developing the people pipeline and they're supporting the people pipeline to deliver what the organization needs to deliver. It's not just an HR function.
Well, I think, and probably some of the best organizations, building on that theme, literally everybody has a role in the development of that person, and everybody actually understands what their role is in the develop. Even if you're just a coworker, colleague, per se, you understand if we're onboarding somebody and somebody is coming into the organization new, here's what I need to be doing on a regular basis. Here's what their manager does. Here's what the executive team does. Here's what HR, so on and so forth. So yeah, it literally takes a village.
Well, if we move on from our first force, I think the conversation so far, we've said absolutely people are a great asset. Therefore, we want their trust as a workforce. The organization wants their trust. But Malcolm, we're seeing a trust deficit among organizations today, and Peter touched on that as well. How do you see from the HR perspective that trust deficit is showing up operationally in our organizations?
Yeah, at least I think, if we kind of use that model or that little vignette that Peter shared about employee shows to see the boss and says, hey, I'm sorry, I have to tell you. You think about the construct of why they're apologizing. They don't trust that the boss is going to respond in a favorable way. So they're trying to, emotionally, let me create a little bit of space because I'm going to disappoint. And so I think if you, just use that vignette and we pull around and we just think about how that then applies, multiple times throughout every different scenario when there's that lack of trust, because trust can't be bought, can't be commanded. Trust has to be, developed, and, you develop through helping others. So all of a sudden that goodwill translates into trust. So you have an employee who's showing up with their skills and talents to get an outcome for what they need out of work. And yet there's this deficit there. And so when you're operating at a deficit, you're just suboptimized. And so, payroll could look flat. It could look like you have this illusion of stability because you have the same amount of people you started the year with, you ended the year. But if trust goes down or, year after year, quarter after quarter, trust continues to decline, things like your delays, your rework, and your churn, your three biggest operational drains just go up. I would call it like a coordination tax, the compounding drag that takes extra work to get done. Just call it the bureaucracy of the organization. That, when there's low trust, it's kind of I'm going to trust you, but I'm going to verify it and everything. Slow adoption. Anything you do just takes value delay, cost of delay starts to add up. And then I really believe the holy grail of lost trust or low trust is the loss of discretionary effort. Because perhaps when we talk about this whole pursuit of engagement, that is such a buzz out there, almost as people chase out almost as big as they chase the concept of greatest asset. But really, what do you do with that engagement is you're really wanting to unlock the discretionary effort of the workforce so that they believe in what you're creating. And so I think across, all of these different factors, what you want to look at is it's so easy to look at the survey score to say engagement went up. What you really want to do is look for all these other areas where the delays, the rework, the coordination, the low discretionary effort, that's the friction in the organization. If you can identify the amount of friction, that's where the money's leaking out. And I think that's where, to the question, it's not this emotional vibe of like a low trust organization. It's just a leaky P&L. The P&L is just not performing at its best because of all of these friction points in place because of the low trust.
Mic drop.
Peter, we've talked, building on what Malcolm said, we've talked in the past about this concept of ready talent that's ready to hit the ground running in the workforce on day one. And we know that comes at a premium. So if that's the case, why is can't find talent and can't keep talent actually the same problem?
Assuming that organizations are suitably attractive and people want to go and work for them in the first place, it's not you that's the problem, it's the talent that's the problem. If it's not available for whatever reasons, one tends to blame one's education system or one's competitors, or that the pool isn't deep enough, it isn't broad enough, it isn't specialized enough, there's something wrong out there. So I better take something that's ready-made because time is short and I don't have the resources to invest in something that's half-baked at the moment. And of course that leads to shortcuts. We've seen it in organizations that I've been involved with in the past, which is that the ready to act now person is actually ready to act now using their understandings, methodologies, processes that they've historically had from a different organization. So they're not actually ready to act now anyway, because they're not applying the new systems and processes from your organization to do a similar job, perhaps. So you have it on, you're losing on both sides. You don't think there's people available to do the job that you want, and those that aren't available aren't necessarily directly available to do the job that you want. So it is two flip sides of the same thing. And I think where the more sensible organizations get it right is actually, well, we've got to take a longer term view on this. I've seen a number of places where the concept of the academy has run really well, which is that if we want good people in 5 years' time, we better start working on them now. And 5 years can go past pretty quickly, and suddenly you've got a coterie of really talented and smart people that you've invested in, and perhaps even there's a little bit of reciprocal loyalty there as well. That takes time, but it's worth it.
But also, I think it's probably a little bit, I'm simpler than that, right? If you can't keep talent, people talk, right? It's a small world, and so those who are in the market who might be looking to go to a different place, you find that you got Glassdoor, you've got LinkedIn, you've got your own network and things along those lines, and just it's funny how people are connected to people you didn't know were connected to you, and so I feel like that also makes it harder, right? So if all the things that Peter said are correct, but if you don't have, good internal, culture and you just sort of are phoning it in all of these areas that we've talked about so far, word gets out, and therefore you're not able to attract the talent.
You've used the term academy companies many times before when we've worked together. And I think that's such a powerful term. Can you talk about what makes something an academy company and how can organizations strive to that?
Yeah, I think, whether it's the HR, whether it could be management principles or something like that. I think people also prescribe to where is that thought leadership, coming from in terms of what really kind of moves a functional area or a market. And I think a lot of it is really using a data-driven practice. That's what, so many of the academies have in common, is that it is a data-driven piece from a stakeholder back. And so I think where the unlock has come from oftentimes too is what we miss in that equation is the stakeholders of the academies and their internal processes are purpose built for their customers. So many times what we do is we might start to copy their practices, but we have different customers, different processes and things like that. And so I think it's more about the true impact of Academy Company is the fact they have an operating system. And that operating system means that they start with the customer and they say, okay, so that we're going to have an internal development program so that we can deliver more value to X stakeholder by what? It's a very methodical equation. But what often gets written up about these Academy companies are their work practices, their programs. And what people do is they read about the programs. They're like, oh, I want the program, versus really getting inside the DNA of the company and saying, okay, it's really about understanding how do we make money? What's unique about our value proposition, and then how do we actually, instead of those, goes back to that original question, if our employees are our greatest asset, well, how do we make them our customers' greatest asset? So I think that's really the power of an Academy company, is they're often, smart, in the sense that they're very specific. They know their customers are typically number one or number two in their market, but they've really figured out how to unlock that value through their people. But it really, again, I think that's where a lot of us, fall in love with the solution versus falling in love with our own problems.
It strikes me too that if we have this trust deficit and people not staying with their companies for a whole career, as was true, maybe 50, 25 years ago, those Academy companies are investing in their talent. And yes, they may see a return because a small handful of them may promote up the ladder and be in-house in 5 years, but they have to be unlocking that discretionary effort to make that investment in their workforce worth it at the time. So it's probably becomes a bit of a self-feeding cycle.
Well, and at the risk of setting Peter Lyle, the guru of culture and values, up, I totally agree with what Malcolm's saying in terms of, and Elise, in terms of people want the programs, they want the operating system, they want that structure. But isn't that really code for we buy into that culture, we buy into the values of that organization?
Yes, and I've seen that recently. Two organizations are part of the same group, and both actually came at this not actually from the point of training our people, or indeed, as in Malcolm's words, being more customer orientated. That they came from it from a sense of community responsibility, which was, we've got not necessarily a failing education system, but an underperforming education system. And we've got lots of young people who don't seem to fit into it, or exit from it quite prematurely. We see the value. They're going to have to follow our rules for a while, but if they do, and if they become apprentices, and if they stick with it for 3 or 4 years, anything is possible. And that organization with the two parts of it now has many, many apprentices who've gone on decades later to run parts of the organization, and actually have opened up different territories, regions all over the world. So the investment that was made wasn't done necessarily from a company basis, but it was a moral responsibility to the community, and that, I think, is quite refreshing, and something perhaps that others could build on as well.
All right, well, shifting gears a bit, I think we're all familiar with the increasing role that AI is playing in our day-to-day working lives. Where do you all see the phenomenon of AI repricing work happening first? And I guess in a related vein, if the leaders of an organization treat AI as just a technology story, what are they missing or getting wrong in that transition?
Well, it's the core of that line, right? It's not a technology story. It's, because that then sort of says that it's just purely a tool, and it's not a tool. It's, going back to the conversation or Malcolm's comment around an operating system. This is the thing that allows you to bolster that operating system. We can start to understand the knowledge that we have. We can actually better access that knowledge that we have within the organization. And we can start to commoditize, it isn't really the right word, but we can programmatically install that information into the wider employee base, I think. So it's far more than just, something that you log into on a day in, day out basis and you just feed in random questions.
Which is what I do on a regular basis, because I'm just a novice in the space and trying to get to grips with it. And my early adopter life is quite a different one, and it's not in this space, that's for sure. But I did read an article the other day which I found fascinating, which was comparing the stage AI is at as a tool or as something more sophisticated than a tool to Excel. And when Excel came along, apparently, the vast majority of people got as far as doing maybe a bit of arithmetical addition or maybe a sum. And they felt quite pleased about that, actually. I've managed to add up this column of numbers. Well done, me. And so they kind of left it at that point, whereas others started scratching the surface and realized that there was a phenomenal power behind this. And actually, you could run pretty sophisticated, large-scale businesses on the back of the formulas and the connections that you can have with the data in your Excel spreadsheets. And so it's actually quite transformational. However, the article went on to say, this is where we're at with AI at the moment, which is the vast majority of us are in that, can do a bit of arithmetic, can do a sum, can do an average, i.e. can type in a fairly banal question. The winners are going to be those that really get to grips with how they can actually use it to transform their business. And whereas we're kind of using it for shortcuts at the moment, that's not what this is all about. It's got to be actually to transform the nature of the work that is unnecessary, that's repetitive, that's wasteful, and do it in a much more slick way. And already we're seeing clients actually asking us if work done has been done by AI. And that's really important, because you have to be honest. And you have to say yes or no. And yes, why? No, why? Because there's an expectation. And by the way, they're not going to pay for 5 days of something if they think it could be done in half an hour by AI, which is a really important aspect of this. They may be able to convince them it can be done in 5 days, but right now their suspicions are that everything can be done in a fraction of the time.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I think what really resonated, what Peter talked about, is using it as a shortcut versus using it to fundamentally change the outcome.
Yeah.
In the HR team, in the HR function right now, probably one of the biggest use cases for AI is in recruiting. You always hear about the bots that are recruiting, and a lot of it is the shortcut of just managing the top of the funnel. But where the real value unlock, if you think about the value stream of what a recruitment process is to select a resource to unlock value against a job. And it's all about the interview process. So really, I think where a lot of the mispricing is the fact that we're buying a lot of AI tools. There's a tremendous amount of consumption, but we're throwing that value at a shortcut versus really understanding your own value stream map to say, what about AI assisted interviewing? Not to replace the interview, but to assist and to grade the interviewee. What's the criteria there? How do we get smarter with that outcome? Typically you hear the stat that 50% of interviews are unsuccessful because of the outcome. What about if you can increase that by 75% so that it's easy to play in the shortcut land of more volume, quicker to hire, but are we getting a better outcome or a better quality of a candidate through the process? So I think it's really, I think about repricing the work. It's the companies that are slowing down and understand their value stream, their process map of what they're looking to solve for, and applying AI at the right spot versus perhaps, like Peter said, applying it at the easy spot, the shortcuts.
Well, I think building on that, we have a client who sort of right now, we've tried to have a conversation with them about how AI can play into their sales process, their marketing process. They don't they want to hear it on the marketing side if it's going to save them marketing spend money. They don't want to hear it on the sales side if they believe that, or if it sort of intimates that they've got to get rid of some of their salespeople. They don't have a large sales force to begin with. And my point with them is, well, why wouldn't you want to take sort of your lowest performing sales folks if you can leverage AI to do better work for them? And I think a lot of that, comes back around to this sort of the loyalty question that Peter hit on a little while ago. But in my mind, I think that also opens up new possibilities for those people. So why don't you just take those people who aren't very good at the top of the funnel work, or in Malcolm's case in the HR space, and put them, after they're sold, after they've made the purchase, or after they've joined the team, and have them do the sort of the post acquisition, the post sale customer service, or in Malcolm's world, the post hire.
Right.
Hey, how are you getting along here? How are things working out? Did we live up to what we said when we recruited you? Are we doing a good job there?
Just going back to your point you made about recruitment, Malcolm, I'm sure you've all heard this anecdote too, but it's worth repeating, I think, which is the employers are using AI to filter as quickly as they can thousands of applications. And they thought this was going to be a great idea. It would slim down the process and get to the interview bit and get the people-to-people bit quicker. And of course, the applicants, they're not stupid. They suddenly realized that they could make tens of thousands of applications instantly as well. So,
Right.
so you've actually got an increase of CVs going out there, applications being made, which is actually counterproductive to what the recruiters wanted in the first place. So where that ends, I have no idea. But
Yeah, it's almost more like the problem is now 100x. So if you're
Yes.
not good at
Yeah.
the funnel,
Yep.
the funnel explodes on you just because of the weight at what happens at the top.
Yeah.
And you think about the failure mode of how many times you can now potentially get it wrong, or just get lost in the noise and everything. So,
I mean, tying across our conversation now, if I'm in the C-suite, there's a lot going on. There's a lot to think about in terms of how we manage our people, how we gain their trust, how we make sure they're ready to work in this age of AI. It's really easy to get into some policy theater in an organization, things that feel like it's action oriented, but in reality, it's distracting from the underlying issues. Ed, what are some of those distractions and core issues that we're not addressing because of other topics?
Well, tons, right? And ultimately what that comes down to is it's really easy for leaders to go, here's a new policy, therefore, that's what we have to abide by, rather than, what's actually happening, what facilitated that policy, why did they feel like they needed to exert some level of control. A good example is the conversation that, I know a lot of organizations are having just now. We're 5 years on since the pandemic, 4 or 5 years on since the pandemic, and you still have a ton of companies who are in some level of, everybody's in the office, some people are remote, or everybody's remote. So you just have this hybrid situation. You have a lot of companies who are now starting to mandate, well, you need to be in the office, because they fear that that's the way I have to make sure that people are doing work and they're being productive, and we're sort of satisfying our capacity. But I think we found you don't actually have to do that. All that is just something that makes the management team feel good, makes them feel like they're in control of things. Really what they need to be doing is looking at all the things that we've talked about, like, what are the actual processes? Do we have the culture and the values and the operating system in place so that it doesn't matter where our team is, they're actually doing what it is that they need to be doing? And hopefully we've done enough to inspire them to that point of discretionary work to help, make the company go to the next level.
The only thing I would add to that, Ed, is speaking personally, My daughter has worked for an organization now remotely. It's her second job, so she's in her mid-20s. And this time, there is no office to go to.
Yeah.
And she actually finds this really hard because there is no social interaction. There's very little cultural
Yeah.
exchange. There's not a sense of the team. Oh, there's Teams, all right, but that's a software program. The sense that actually collaboratively this group of people could be bouncing off each other, generating ideas, coming up with better, more intriguing ways, or just actually having some fun doesn't exist. And so this isn't hybrid, this is fully remote. And the next job she has, it'll not be like that. The human interaction piece is still really important.
It's Peter. It's funny you mentioned that. It's you think about like Meta, the metaverse that was going to rule the world 3 or 4 years ago. Instead of it being this like alternative, it became the reality. You just described it.
Yeah.
Where there is this online workplace that exists where that's where you spend your world.
Yeah.
It's no longer a theoretical world. It is the real world now.
Yeah.
In scenarios like that.
So, Malcolm, just to close us out, let's put the operator lens on. If we've got to enact doing the hard work of an organization, how might you apply procurement principles to people spend, and how would you measure productivity to catch leakage in the workforce early?
Yeah, you think about too. I mean, the reason why this is so important because all of these tools, it is an investment. And typically your cost of your people. So whether it's the true people, it could be your contingent workers, your contractors, your shared services, your BPOs, all these tools that you're now using to get the work done, all add up, but they don't sit in one spot. But the first piece is to really think about the overall spend. I've always been a big fan of procurement. Early career learned that they're more than just contracting. There's this concept of always think about better buy, better spend, smarter spend, the concept of continuous cost optimization, and also to the discipline that, great procurement runs with a quarterly business review, typically where they're constantly pouring over there to think about contingencies and ways to have multiple strategies. So when you translate that, what it means is that if you think about it, that team wakes up every day thinking about how do I offset inflationary costs? How do I get ahead of the curve? How do I always do that? And many times in the people, we're still fighting one-on-one problems. We're trying to, how do we regain trust? How do we come back and also work on attrition, not even thinking about the cost impact of the leaky P&L that we're talking about, plus the overall run rate of the enterprise. And so I think what it helps for us is when we start to think about that lens of that tools is to really apply that same discipline. So take, for example, a 10-person team with a $1 million remit. Let's just make it easy math here. Each one of those 10 workers or 10, cost 100,000. One goes down, so it's a 900,000, a 10% improvement. The easy answer is always, it was in my budget, I need a backfill. The procurement answer would be, can we take advantage of the 10% cost savings and still get the same outcome? Or now, with this move, is there a way that we can take that one role and take an AI agent, take a recoordination? Is there work that we can offset? Can we take 15% of the manual effort off of the other 9 and move it into a shared service center? Move it to a nearshore, and rethinking about how to constantly evolve that model where you're thinking about better buy, better spend, and not falling into the fallacy of, well, it was in my budget. And I think that's even the fact it's less about it being in the budget. It's more about the word my. It's all about our budget. Here's an opportunity to unlock that value. So I think what often happens is if you only use an HR toolkit, you only think about the HR problems, it's a misallocation of scrutiny. When you bring that procurement toolkit to every people decision that you're making, particularly when it comes to the investment or the buying of talent, that's where you get a better idea of, are you leaving something on the table?
Well, I know you have an engineering background, Malcolm, and there's, as well as a procurement version of this, there is an engineering version of this. We've talked before about Lotus Cars, Colin Chapman, the famous designer, who had this wonderful phrase, which was just add lightness. And of course, you can't add lightness. Well, an engineer can, because they can think of different metals or different suspension or different materials, ways of actually making the thing that has to be moved move more quickly because it's lighter. And so if you apply that to the logic of how you hire and manage your people, can we actually change the constituent parts? Can we actually remove some elements? Can we change how they interact with each other? And I like this concept, which is solving a problem just doesn't mean adding more to it. Less is definitely more, you know.
Well, and to
I think
tie the thread with where we started, just because you're actively managing, cost out via attrition or making the organization lighter doesn't automatically mean that you're harming the individuals along the way, because you've got now more space on the team. There's an opportunity for someone to step up, learn more, take on a new opportunity, or perform their work in a different way. So it is bringing it full circle to you're still investing in your people as an asset.
absolutely.
Well, that is this episode of the Talent Ledger: 3 Forces Repricing the Employment Deal: Trust, Skills, and AI Repricing Work. If you want the full context, the 4-part article series is available via our Talent Ledger landing page or through our media spot partner, Strategic Magazine. The link is in the first comment on this video or podcast post. If this was useful, please like the episode and drop a comment and let us know what question you're wrestling with right now. Which of these 3 forces is doing the most damage in your organization? Where do you see the biggest policy theater distraction? Reread your comments and we'll use them to shape future content.